The stagecoach lurched to a groaning halt in a cloud of red dust, and Ellen Finley stepped down onto the packed earth of a town she had never once heard of, with nothing in her pockets but a folded letter that no longer meant anything, and a heart that felt as crumpled as the dress she had been wearing for 3 days straight. She stood on the edge of the main street and looked up at the painted sign hanging above the general store. It read Caldwell Creek, and the name landed on her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She was supposed to be in Harrow's Bend, 40 miles east, where a man named Clifton Graves was waiting to marry her. The thought of Clifton Graves no longer stirred anything inside her except a dull and distant relief, because Clifton Graves had sent a second letter, one she had received only the morning she boarded the stage, informing her plainly that he had reconsidered the arrangement, that he had met someone of more suitable circumstance, and that he hoped she would find her way well enough on her own. Ellen had not cried when she read the letter. She had folded it neatly, tucked it into the bodice of her dress, and climbed aboard the stage in Denver with her one battered trunk and exactly 11 cents to her name, telling herself she would figure something out when she arrived. She had figured nothing out. She had simply gotten off at the wrong stop, because when the driver had called a name she thought sounded like Harrow's Bend, she had gathered her things and descended, and it was only when the stage rolled away that she realized her mistake. Now she stood in Caldwell Creek, Colorado, in the spring of 1882, completely alone, and the afternoon sun was pressing down on her shoulders like a firm and disapproving hand. The town was not much to look at. There was the general store, a blacksmith's, a saloon with a hand-lettered sign that said the word was Dusty's, a small white church at the far end of the street that leaned ever so slightly to the left, and a scattering of wooden buildings that looked like they had been argued into existence rather than built with any plan. A few horses were hitched to posts. A dog slept in the middle of the road with absolutely no intention of moving for anyone. Ellen drew herself up to her full height, which was not very impressive, and walked toward the general store, because general stores were the kind of place where a woman could stand without drawing too much immediate comment. The bell above the door jingled as she pushed inside. The air smelled of sawdust, tobacco, and dried apples, and behind the counter stood a broad woman of perhaps 50 with iron-gray hair and the look of someone who had heard every possible story and disbelieved most of them. "Afternoon," the woman said. Her name, as Ellen would learn shortly, was Martha Greer, and she ran the store with her husband Harold, who was apparently somewhere out back and useful mainly for lifting heavy things. "Good afternoon," Ellen said, keeping her voice steady. "I seem to have gotten off the stage at the wrong stop. I was meant for Harrow's Bend." Martha Greer looked at her over a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. "Next stage through here heading east won't come until Thursday. That's 4 days from now." Ellen felt the information settle into her bones. 4 days. She had 11 cents. She had no relatives, no friends, no employer, and no fiance. She was 23 years old and she had, by every practical measure, run out of road. "Is there any work available in town?" Ellen asked, and she managed to ask it without her voice catching even once, which she considered a small private victory. Martha Greer studied her for a long moment. "You know how to keep accounts?" "I do. I also cook, I sew, and I can manage inventory." "Harold's been after me to let him hire someone to help in here since his back went bad last winter." Martha set down the bolt of fabric she had been measuring. "I can offer you a cot in the storeroom and your meals and $1.50 for the 4 days. It won't make you rich." "It will make me not starve," Ellen said, and something about the frankness of her answer made Martha Greer's expression shift just slightly, the way a closed door shifts when someone on the other side tests the handle. "All right then, bring your trunk around back." Ellen was halfway out the door when the bell above it jangled with considerably more force than it had when she entered, and a man walked in with the particular gait of someone who spent most of his time in the saddle balanced, unhurried, slightly bow-legged in a way that looked natural rather than awkward. He was carrying a list in one hand and wearing a hat that had been through some weather. He was, Ellen estimated, somewhere around 26 or 27, with dark eyes that catalogued the room in a single sweep, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 2 or 3 days. He stopped when he saw Ellen standing in the doorway with her trunk half in and half out, and something shifted in those dark eyes, not rudely but with a certain focused attention, the way a man looks at something unexpected that has just appeared in a familiar landscape. "Jonas Turner," Martha said from behind the counter, and the way she said his name suggested she said it often and not always with equal amounts of patience. "About time you came in for your supplies. You were supposed to be here 2 days ago." "Had trouble with the south fence," Jonas Turner said, and his voice was lower than Ellen expected, not in a performed way but in the way of a man who was simply put together that way. He glanced at Ellen again. "I don't think I've seen you before." "You haven't," Ellen said. "I arrived on the stage about 15 minutes ago. Wrong town." She said it plainly, the way she had decided she would say it because there was no point in dressing it up. Jonas Turner looked at her for a moment in a way that was not pitying, but was something adjacent to understanding. The kind of look that comes from a person who has also, at some point, found themselves somewhere they did not plan to be. "Well," he said, "Caldwell Creek isn't the worst place to end up by accident." "I'll take your word for that," Ellen said, and she picked up her end of the trunk and went around back. Over the following 2 days, Ellen learned the rhythm of the general store. She learned that Martha Greer was suspicious of strangers but loyal past all reason to anyone who proved themselves useful. She learned that Harold Greer was a gentleman with a ruined back, and a talent for identifying exactly which barrel a particular creak in the floorboards was coming from. She learned that Caldwell Creek had a population of approximately 230 souls, that it had been founded in 1874 after a small silver strike that had petered out within 18 months but left enough people with enough stubbornness to keep the town alive anyway, and that the surrounding countryside was cattle country now, flat and open, and cut through with creeks that ran cold even in summer. She also learned, piece by piece and without particularly meaning to, about Jonas Turner. He came into the store on the second morning to pick up a crate of nails he had ordered. Martha mentioned, while he was loading them, that Ellen was helping out until Thursday. Jonas Turner nodded at this as if it were ordinary information, but he came back at noon with a question about whether Martha had received a particular order of fence wire, and the question seemed, upon examination, to require rather more time to answer than was strictly necessary. On the third day he came in after closing time and knocked on the back door, which Martha answered with the expression of someone who had already figured out something before anyone else was willing to say it. "I was heading to the Hendersons' place," Jonas said, "and I thought I might ask if anyone here needed anything from that direction, since they run the best produce out of their garden." Martha looked at him. "Jonas Turner, that farm is 3 miles south and I cannot think of a single thing I need from it." There was a pause. "I thought Miss Finley might want a walk," he said. Ellen, who was standing at the back of the storeroom mending a split seam in her traveling dress because she was determined to get at least 1 more year out of it, heard this through the thin wall and felt something she had not felt in a considerable amount of time, which was the particular warmth of being thought of by someone who had no particular obligation to think of her. She came to the door. "I would like a walk," she said. "Thank you." Martha said nothing, but her expression was the same one it got when she had been proven correct about something she had not yet announced. The evening was soft and gold, the kind of spring evening that happens in Colorado when the afternoon heat has settled, and the air cools from the mountains and everything smells of grass and distance. Jonas Turner walked with his hat in his hand, and Ellen walked beside him along the road that led south out of town, and they talked. She told him about Denver, where she had been working as a bookkeeper's assistant for a merchant named Harlan Pope for 3 years, saving every cent she could, and sending some home to her mother in St. Louis until her mother passed the previous October. She told him that when her mother died, she found herself with no remaining family and no particular reason to stay in Denver, and that the arrangement with Clifton Graves had been organized through a correspondence service and had seemed, at the time, like a reasonable solution to the problem of being alone in the world. She did not tell him about the letter, but she did not pretend the arrangement had ended in any other way than by the other party's choice, because she refused to be dishonest about something that was not her fault. Jonas Turner listened with the focused quiet of someone who was genuinely paying attention rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "And you?" Ellen asked, when she had said enough about herself that continuing would start to feel like complaint. "How long have you been in Caldwell Creek?" 7 years, he said. "Came down from Wyoming when I was 19. Worked as a hired hand for a man named Cal Dawes for 3 years, saved enough to buy 40 acres of my own, and I've been building the place up since." "Do you have family here?" "A brother in Pueblo. My folks passed when I was 16, same winter, both of them. The ranch is what I have." Ellen looked at him sideways in the golden light. "Then you understand," she said, "about being without people." He looked at her directly then, and the look was so steady and honest that she felt something shift in the architecture of her chest. "Yes," he said simply, "I do." They reached the Henderson farm, and Mrs. Henderson, a round, cheerful woman who grew things with a ferocious dedication, pressed upon them both a sack of early onions and some dried sage, and seemed delighted to have company. Jonas helped with a fence post that had been troubling Mr. Henderson for a week, and Ellen sat with Mrs. Henderson on the porch and drank a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with religious conviction, and listened to the old woman talk about the valley in a way that made it sound like somewhere worth staying. Walking back in the near dark, Ellen asked Jonas Turner what his ranch was called. "I never named it," he said. "Always felt like naming it was a thing I'd do when it was finished, and it's not finished yet." "Will it ever be finished?" He thought about it. "Probably not. But I keep adding to it anyway." She smiled at the road ahead of her. "That seems like a very sensible way to live." Thursday came with the same relentless sunshine that had characterized all the days before it, and Ellen stood outside the general store with her trunk at her feet, and the stage due in approximately 2 hours, and she was waiting, but she was not exactly sure what she was waiting for. Jonas Turner appeared around the corner of the feed store on a roan horse named Copper, and he dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who has done it 10,000 times, and he stood in the street with his hat on and his hands in his pockets and looked at her trunk. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. "I heard the stage is running late. Driver had trouble outside of Benson's Crossing." "How late?" "Martha thinks maybe tomorrow morning." Ellen looked at her trunk. She had 11 cents when she arrived. She now had $1.50, and she still had nowhere to go in Harrow's Bend. The man she was supposed to marry had withdrawn his proposal. She had no employment waiting, no lodgings arranged, no connections. She had simply been planning to get on the stage and go there because it was the direction she had originally been pointed. "Can I ask you something?" Jonas said. "Yes." "What's in Harrow's Bend?" She looked up at him. In the morning light, with the dust of the street settling around him and the mountains visible in the distance behind his left shoulder, he looked like something painted onto the landscape, like something that belonged there so completely that removing him would leave a visible gap. "Nothing anymore," she said honestly. "I was going there because I didn't know where else to go." Jonas Turner looked at his boots for a moment, and then he looked at her, and when he spoke his voice had the careful quality of a man who has thought about something for several days and is choosing his words with more than usual care. "I have a ranch that needs a great deal of work still," he said. "I have been managing it alone for 4 years, and I am not managing it as well as it could be managed. The accounts are a disaster. Martha says you're the best hand at figures she's seen in 10 years. I would not propose to take advantage of a woman in a difficult situation." He stopped. "That isn't what I'm doing." "I know," Ellen said, because she did know. "What I am saying," he continued, "is that Caldwell Creek is a decent town. The people here are mostly good. The land is good. And I think, he paused, and in the pause she could see him working to be honest rather than strategic. I think that in 4 days I have had more good conversations than I have had in the past year, and I would not like them to stop if there is any reason for them not to. Ellen Finley stood on the main street of Caldwell Creek, Colorado, in the spring of 1882, with her one battered trunk and $1.50 and absolutely no plan, and she thought about what she wanted. Not what made sense, not what was safe, not what she should want, but what she actually wanted. It was an unusual experience. She had been so busy surviving that she had largely stopped asking herself the question. What she wanted was the Henderson farm in the evening light and the smell of grass and distance, and a man who listened when she spoke and had dark eyes that told the truth even when his mouth was working out how to. "All right," she said. "I'll stay, for now." Jonas Turner smiled, and it was the kind of smile that starts slow and then becomes complete, and it changed his face into something Ellen thought she could look at for a very long time. "For now," he agreed. The storeroom cot became untenable as a long-term solution within approximately 24 hours, and it was Martha Greer who solved the problem, as Martha Greer seemed to solve most practical problems in Caldwell Creek, by announcing that the widow Eula Marsh had a spare room and was looking for company, and that Ellen would take it and pay $2 a month from her wages, which Martha had adjusted upward to account for the indefinite arrangement. Eula Marsh was 70 years old, 4'10", and had an opinion about absolutely everything, delivered with the confidence of someone who had been right often enough to stop entertaining doubt. She had come to Colorado in 1859 with her husband Daniel, who had died of influenza in 1877, and she had stayed because Colorado was where her husband was buried, and she intended to be buried next to him, and that was the end of it. She took one look at Ellen on the evening Ellen arrived with her trunk and said, "You have sensible eyes. Most young women who come through here don't have sensible eyes. They have either frightened eyes or ridiculous eyes, and neither is useful. Hang your things in the wardrobe, and I'll make tea." Ellen hung her things in the wardrobe and went to have tea, and found herself, for the first time since her mother died, in the company of someone who felt like a particular kind of home. Over the following weeks, the shape of Ellen's life in Caldwell Creek assembled itself piece by piece with a naturalness that surprised her. She worked mornings at the general store, managing the accounts with a thoroughness that delighted Martha and bewildered Harold, who had been operating the business on a system he described as keeping the numbers in my head, and which had resulted in 3 years of not entirely knowing whether they were making money or losing it. Ellen established within the first week that they were making money, but less than they should have been because of a supplier in Denver who had been charging them 10% above the agreed rate and apparently counting on no one to notice. Martha wrote a very pointed letter to Denver. Ellen helped draft it. In the afternoons she was free, and afternoons in Caldwell Creek in the spring of 1882 had a particular quality that she found she looked forward to with an intensity that was disproportionate to their ordinary circumstances. Often as not, Jonas Turner would appear at the general store around noon, ostensibly to collect something he had ordered, and he would ask, with the same careful casualness that had not yet stopped being transparent, whether she might want to ride out to the ranch and see how the new fencing was coming along, or to look at the creek crossing that had washed out in the spring thaw, or to consult on the question of whether the barn needed a new door now or could wait until fall. Ellen did not own a horse and had not ridden since she was a girl, but Jonas had a mare named Daisy who was approximately 12 years old and had made a lifelong commitment to gentleness. And on Daisy's back, Ellen discovered that she remembered more about riding than she had thought, and also that the land around Caldwell Creek was the kind of landscape that required being seen from horseback to be properly understood. It was wide and open, and cut through with long, shallow draws where cottonwoods grew thick, and the ground stayed green even in dry spells. The mountains were always visible to the west, a permanent dramatic backdrop that made even ordinary days feel significant. The sky was enormous in a way that sky in cities never was, the kind of sky that had weather happening in it at all hours, great building columns of cloud, and the occasional distant grumble of thunder and light that cracked across the afternoon in long, brilliant branching lines. She went out to the ranch for the first time on a Thursday, 1 week after she had almost left on the stage. Jonas Turner's 40 acres were situated along a creek 3 miles west of town, backed up against a low ridge that broke the worst of the north wind in winter and turned gold in the evening light. The house was small but solid, 2 rooms with a lean-to kitchen added on the back, built of logs that Jonas had cut himself from the ridge and chinked with a determination that was evident in the straightness of the walls. "It's not much," he said as they rode up to it. "It's more than not much," Ellen said. "It's exactly what it is. There's nothing wrong with that." He looked at her. "Most people say it's a work in progress. Most people can't recognize when something is good just because it isn't finished," she said. And she meant the house, but she also, she realized, meant something else, and the way his eyes changed told her he understood both meanings. The ranch had 40 head of cattle, a small vegetable garden that was losing a slow battle with the weeds, a chicken coop that housed 8 hens and a rooster of legendary bad temper, and a barn that was considerably more impressive than the house, which Jonas explained by saying that the cattle needed a sound roof before he did. "That is either very admirable or very backwards," Ellen said. "Probably both," he said. She helped him with the vegetable garden that afternoon because it was April and the weeds were winning, and there was something deeply satisfying about pulling them out by the root and throwing them aside. They worked side by side in the plot between the house and the barn, and the work was comfortable in the way that physical labor alongside someone who is matching your pace is comfortable. And they talked while they worked with the loose, easy quality of people who have stopped performing for each other and are simply present together. He told her about Wyoming, where he had grown up on a failing cattle spread that had been in the Turner family for 20 years and had been beaten finally not by bad luck, but by a series of brutal winters that had killed most of the herd 2 years running. His father had given up after the second winter, not in an obvious dramatic way but in the slow, quiet way of a man who simply stops fighting, and his mother had followed him into that giving up out of love or exhaustion or both, and by the time Jonas was 16 they were both gone and he and his brother Roy were on their own. "Roy went to work in the mines," Jonas said. "He likes being underground, which I have never been able to understand. I like being able to see all the way to the horizon." "You need to be able to see what's coming," Ellen said. He stopped weeding and looked at her. "Yes, that's exactly it." She had not meant it as a particular insight, but the way he looked at her made her feel that it was, and the feeling was warm and slightly dizzying, the way the sun feels when you step out of shadow. The weeks became a month, and the month folded itself naturally into the next, and somewhere in the process Ellen Finley stopped counting days until some theoretical future departure and started simply living in the one that was happening around her. She bought 2 new dresses from the catalog Martha stocked, nothing grand but practical and clean, and she let Eula Marsh hem them because Eula's eyesight was still excellent and her stitches were half the size of Ellen's. She started attending the small church at the leaning end of the street on Sunday mornings, not from any great religious conviction, but because Reverend Alcott gave sermons that were brief and sensible, and the congregation was mostly people she had begun to think of as her people. She started to think of Caldwell Creek as hers. The moment she recognized this, sitting on Eula's porch in the late afternoon of a Sunday in May with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and the sound of someone's children running in the street, she set the teacup down and sat very still with the recognition for a while, turning it over, examining it, checking it for cracks. It held. It was solid all the way through. Eula Marsh came out of the house with the teapot and refilled Ellen's cup without being asked and settled into the other chair with the satisfaction of someone who is exactly where they intended to be. "You're staying," Eula said. It was not a question. "I think I am," Ellen said. "Good," Eula said. "Now if that young man would collect himself and say what is obviously true, we could all get on with things." Ellen looked at her. "Jonas Turner has ridden past this house on one errand or another every single evening for 3 weeks," Eula said. "My eyesight is excellent, as I have mentioned, and the feed store is not in this direction." Ellen felt warmth climb from her collarbone to her hairline. We're friends." "Of course you are," Eula said. "And you will continue to be friends while 2 reasonably intelligent adults gradually drive themselves mad with it, because that is what young people do now apparently. In my day, Daniel Marsh walked up to my father's porch, took his hat off, and said that he intended to marry me, and what did my father think? My father said he thought it was fine, and we were married the following April, and that was the end of it. It was a different time," Ellen said. "Human nature doesn't change nearly as much as people like to claim," said Eula. That same evening, Jonas Turner knocked on Eula Marsh's front door with a bunch of wildflowers from the meadow west of his ranch. And when Ellen answered the door, they both stood for a moment on either side of the threshold, looking at each other with the mutual recognition of people who have arrived at the same place from different directions. He held out the flowers. They were larkspur and some yellow thing Ellen did not know the name of, and a few stalks of dried grass that had been included either for texture or by accident. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing." Ellen took the flowers. "I'm willing," she said. From inside the house came the sound of Eula Marsh putting her teacup down with great decisiveness, which was the sound of someone who has been proven right. The courtship of Ellen Finley and Jonas Turner was conducted in the manner of 1882 Colorado, which meant primarily in public, and with a great deal of purposeful activity, because the West did not have much patience for people who simply sat still and gazed at each other, however much they might have preferred it. They rode together, they worked together, they attended social events at the church and the occasional gathering at someone's home, and they talked, always, with the particular quality of conversation that exists between people who have decided to know each other as completely as possible and are proceeding with that project with dedication. Ellen learned that Jonas read more than anyone in Caldwell Creek suspected, that he kept a small shelf of books in the house that included a battered copy of Moby Dick that had been his father's, a collection of Marcus Aurelius's writings that he had traded for in Pueblo, and a practical guide to cattle management that he had read so many times the binding had given up. She learned that he could repair almost anything mechanical, but was genuinely baffled by the piano in the church, and that he had tried 3 times to learn, and each time the piano had, in his words, won. She learned that he was privately funny in a way he did not widely advertise, that he had strong opinions about horses and moderate opinions about most other things, and that his particular form of stubbornness was not the kind that refused to listen, but the kind that, once it had listened and considered, did not yield without good reason. Jonas learned that Ellen had grown up in St. Louis in a household that had been comfortable until it wasn't, that her father had died when she was 11, and that she and her mother had spent the following 12 years in the particular, dignified poverty of women who refused to stop acting like they had options. He learned that she had taught herself bookkeeping from a manual. She borrowed from the public library, and had then borrowed again and again, until the librarian eventually just gave it to her. He learned that she was capable of a stubbornness that made his look like mild preference, that she laughed with her whole face in a way that was impossible to look at without feeling better about everything, and that she was, beneath the practical efficient surface of her, a person of considerable depth and warmth and feeling, who had been keeping those qualities carefully managed because she had not previously had anyone to offer them to. He thought about this, and about her, constantly, in the way that a person thinks about something that has rearranged their interior landscape, and they are still in the process of working out what the new map looks like. On a warm evening in June, they rode out to the creek that ran through the back corner of his property, where the cottonwoods were fully leafed, and the water moved over smooth stones with a sound like conversation. And they sat on the bank in the last long light, and Jonas threw a stone into the water and watched it sink and said, without looking at her, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as what it actually is, and not as something I'm saying because it's expected." Ellen waited. "I have been alone for a long time," he said. "Not in a way that made me miserable, because I built things that mattered and I had work that I believed in, and people in town I respected. But alone in the way where the work is good and the day is good, and at the end of it there's no one to tell it to." He was quiet for a moment. "You stepping off that stage wrong was the best thing that has happened to me in 7 years in Caldwell Creek." Ellen looked at the creek moving over its stones. The light was going golden, and the cottonwoods were whispering above them, and somewhere a meadowlark was making its argument to the end of the day. "I came here with nothing," she said. "I came here by accident, to marry a man I had never met, and it didn't work out, and I should by rights have felt like a complete failure. And instead I feel," she stopped, because the feeling was so large and so various that it required a moment to locate the word for it. "I feel like I arrived somewhere," she said at last. "Like the getting off at the wrong stop was actually the getting off at the right stop, and I just didn't know it until I was here." Jonas turned and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and the look was so complete and so honest that she felt it everywhere, all the way down to her bones. "Stay," he said. It was one word, and it had in it everything that the longer speeches had only been circling around, the way water circles a stone without ever getting to the center of it. "Stay here, with me. I know it's," he stopped. "I know it's soon, and I know you didn't come here for this, but I am asking you, stay." Ellen looked at him for a long moment in the Golden Creek light and the meadowlark's song, and she thought about Denver, where she had been alone in a practical way, and about St. Louis, where she had been alone in a different and colder way, and about the months between, when she had been pointed at a future that had been chosen for her, and that she had accepted because it was the available future. And she thought about the past 2 months, in which she had been more herself than she had been in years, and more known. And more seen. "I wasn't planning on leaving," she said. "I've been staying since April, Jonas. I was just waiting for you to ask." He reached over and took her hand with the kind of gentleness that is absolutely specific to a strong person being careful about something precious, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat by the creek in the last of the evening light until the stars came out and the meadowlark went quiet and the creek went on saying whatever it was saying. The question of marriage was raised not in a grand or theatrical way, but in the practical manner of two people who had established, over the course of a June and a July and the beginning of an August, that they were building something together, and that the building had a natural next step. Jonas talked to Reverend Alcott, who was a practical and decent man who had performed 14 marriages in Caldwell Creek and found each one of them moving, and Reverend Alcott confirmed that he could perform the ceremony on the second Saturday of August. Jonas then went to Eula Marsh's house and asked Ellen if the second Saturday of August would suit her, presenting this not as a proposal in the traditional sense, but as a question to be answered on its own terms. And Ellen said it suited her perfectly, and Jonas said good, and they stood in Eula's parlor smiling at each other in the helpless way of people who are very happy and slightly overwhelmed by it. Eula Marsh, from the kitchen, called out that she had been waiting for this since April, and that she hoped the dress would be better than what Ellen had been wearing when she arrived, which was not a criticism, but a statement of logistical priority. The dress became a project of considerable community investment. Martha Greer produced 3 yards of pale blue cotton from the back of the storeroom that had been waiting for exactly the right purpose, in her opinion, for 2 years. Eula did the cutting and the major sewing. Mrs. Henderson contributed lace from a Belgian collar she had brought from Ohio 30 years ago and had been saving for something worthy. The Reverend's wife, a kind woman named Alice Alcott, contributed a row of pearl buttons from a blouse that had seen better days but whose buttons were perfect. And Ellen sat in Eula's kitchen over the course of 3 evenings and sewed them on herself, each one placed with a care that was both practical and ceremonial. On the morning of the second Saturday of August, Ellen Finley stood in Eula Marsh's parlor in the pale blue dress with the Belgian lace and the pearl buttons, and looked at herself in the mirror that Eula had brought from the bedroom for the occasion. And she did not look like a woman who had arrived in the wrong town with 11 cents and a broken arrangement. She looked like herself, which was, she had come to understand, considerably better. "You look exactly right," Eula Marsh said, which was the highest compliment Eula gave, and Ellen knew it and received it accordingly. The church was small and slightly crooked and full. The whole of Caldwell Creek had come, which was 230 people in a building designed for 100, which meant people standing in the doorway and looking through windows and calling out encouragement from the churchyard in a manner that Reverend Alcott bore, with the patience of a man who understood that community expressions of joy did not have to be orderly to be genuine. Jonas Turner stood at the front of the church in the best clothes he owned, which were clean and pressed to within an inch of their lives by his own determined hand, and watched Ellen walk toward him down the aisle that was not really an aisle so much as a narrow gap between the pews, and his expression was one that she carried with her for the rest of her life. The expression of a man who was looking at something he had not let himself believe was possible and finding out that it was real. Reverend Alcott performed the ceremony with the brevity and sincerity that characterized everything he did, and when he reached the vows he paused and said, "Now, the two of you have written your own words as I understand it. Jonas, you first." Jonas Turner, who was not a man given to public speeches, took Ellen's hands in his and looked at her directly and said, "I want to tell you that I do not take lightly the fact that you chose this when you didn't have to. You could have gotten on the Thursday stage and gone anywhere. You stayed, and you made this town and this ranch and my life into something I could not have imagined on my own. I will spend everything I have making it worth the choice." There was not a sound in the church or the churchyard or anywhere nearby except the distant creek, which went on saying whatever it had been saying. Ellen held his hands and said, "I came here by accident and found out that accidents are sometimes the truest navigation. I do not have much to bring you except myself, and I'm bringing all of that. I will be your partner and your friend and the person who tells you when the accounts are wrong, and I will be here for every part of it, the finished and the unfinished." Reverend Alcott pronounced them married, and Jonas Turner kissed his wife in front of 230 people, and the dog that had been sleeping in the road, and had apparently decided that this was worth waking up for. The reception was in the churchyard, and it was loud and warm, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a second fiddle, and Martha Greer produced 3 pies from somewhere, and Mrs. Henderson's onion and herb bread appeared in sufficient quantity to be suspicious, suggesting advanced planning on her part, and the evening went on until the stars were fully out, and the children were asleep in their parents' arms, and the fiddles were going quiet, and Jonas and Ellen Turner rode west out of town together on Copper and Daisy into the dark that smelled of sage and grass, and the night sky of Colorado in August, which is one of the finest night skies that exists anywhere. The ranch received them with the silence of a place that has been waiting. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that cannot be fully described because it was made of 10,000 ordinary things, each one ordinary only in isolation and extraordinary in their accumulation. Ellen reorganized the ranch's finances within the first month and discovered, as she had discovered with the general store, that the operation was better than it looked, and that some of the appearance of shortfall was the result of keeping numbers in one's head versus keeping them on paper. She sat at the small table in the kitchen with a ledger Jonas had bought in Pueblo and wrote everything down, income and expenditure, and the price of cattle at market, and the cost of feed, and the state of the hay stores, and the expected return on the 40 head. And what emerged from this accounting was a picture that was, with careful management, genuinely sustainable. Jonas expanded the vegetable garden because Ellen's cooking revealed that it had been planted by a man who ate what was available rather than what was good. And the new garden had proper rows and succession planting and herbs along the south wall of the barn where they got the sun all afternoon. The weeds were managed with a thoroughness that the previous garden had never known. The ranch still did not have a name. This was a running conversation between them, the kind of conversation that a couple keeps returning to over meals and rides and the quiet of winter evenings, trying on names and discarding them for reasons ranging from practical to aesthetic to simply not feeling right. Jonas suggested Turner Creek, after the creek that ran through the back of the property. Ellen said it was a bit obvious. Ellen suggested Larkspur, after the wildflowers that grew along the creek bank. Jonas said it sounded like a place for horses rather than cattle. They tried various combinations of their names and rejected them on grounds of sentiment. They tried geographical descriptions and rejected them on grounds of being too common. The ranch went unnamed through the first winter, which was cold but not brutal, and the cattle came through it in good shape, and Jonas and Ellen came through it closer than they had been before, which is the usual outcome of two people spending a long Colorado winter in a small house, provided they are the right two people. In the spring of the second year, Ellen found out she was expecting. She told Jonas on a morning in March when the snow was still on the ground, but the light had changed to the particular quality that announces the coming thaw, sitting across the breakfast table from him with the knowledge organized and ready, and her hands folded in her lap. Jonas looked at her for a moment and then looked at the table and then looked at her again, and the sequence of expressions that crossed his face in those few seconds was one of the most remarkable things she had ever seen on a human face, shock and joy, and something that looked very much like a man being rearranged from the inside. Are you well?" he managed. "I am very well," she said. "I saw Mrs. Alcott, who has some nursing training, and she confirmed it, probably October." Jonas got up from the table and came around to her and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands in his the same way he had in the church, with that particular careful gentleness, and looked at her with everything he felt very clear on his face. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. "Ellen." Jonas. He pressed his forehead against her hands and stayed like that for a long moment while the morning light came through the kitchen window, and the fire went on burning in the stove, and somewhere outside, the first bird of spring was making its argument against the cold. The news traveled through Caldwell Creek at the speed that news always traveled in small towns, which was approximately the speed of light, and the response was warm and immediate and practically expressed. Eula Marsh appeared with knitting wool and a pattern for a blanket the day after Ellen mentioned it to her, and appeared again 3 days later with the blanket already half done, and the look on her face suggested she had been waiting for this occasion for some time. Martha Greer quietly reduced Ellen's hours at the store to mornings only and raised her pay, which was Martha's version of tenderness. The pregnancy was, by the standards of 1882, relatively uncomplicated. Ellen felt ill in the mornings for the first 2 months and then felt fine, and as the summer progressed, she adapted the work of the ranch to what she could manage and let Jonas handle the rest, which he did without comment and without the particular kind of anxious hovering that she had feared, because he treated her as a capable adult who was also growing a person, which she appreciated enormously. Their son arrived on a windy afternoon in early October, helped into the world by Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered 6 children of her own, and assisted with a dozen others, and whose presence was calm and authoritative and exactly right. Jonas sat outside the kitchen door through the labor with the expression of a man waiting for a verdict on something that mattered more than anything, And when Ellen's cry and then the baby's cry came through the wall, he stood up and put his hat on and then took it off again and stood there holding it. And Mrs. Henderson opened the door and said, "You have a son. Come in." Jonas Turner stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at his wife in the bed, and at the small, red, indignant creature she was holding, and his face did the thing it had done in the church, that expression of a man finding out that something he had not allowed himself to believe was real was in fact real. "Hello," he said softly to the baby. The baby, who had been working up to another protest, went quiet as if the voice was familiar. They named the boy Daniel, after Eula Marsh's husband, because Eula had been so fundamental to Ellen's early days in Caldwell Creek that it seemed right to give the gesture of the name. And Eula received the news of it sitting in her chair by the window in a way that kept her face very still, which was what Eula did when something moved her considerably. With Daniel came the naming of the ranch. It happened one evening in November, when the baby was sleeping in the cradle Jonas had built from cottonwood in the month before October, and the fire was burning well, and Jonas and Ellen were sitting at the kitchen table with tea, and the satisfaction of a day that had gone as days with an infant and a cattle ranch, and a Colorado autumn can reasonably be expected to go, which was fine, fundamentally fine, with the particular texture of hard good work and warm evenings. "I know what I want to call it," Jonas said. Ellen looked up. "The wrong stop," he said. "That's what brought all of this. You got off at the wrong stop and everything right happened." Ellen considered this. "You cannot call a cattle ranch the wrong stop." "I know," he smiled. "What about last stop, because you stopped here and didn't need to go any further?" Ellen looked at her tea. She felt the name settle into her. "Last Stop Ranch," she said slowly. "Last Stop Ranch," he said, and that was what it became. Jonas carved the name into a piece of cedar plank and mounted it on the gate post at the entrance to the property. And it read Last Stop Ranch in letters that were not entirely even but were entirely sincere. And Ellen rode through that gate on the morning after it went up and looked at it, and felt the full weight of how far she had come from a stagecoach platform with 11 cents and a broken arrangement. The years that followed were the years of a life being built, and a life being built has a different quality than a life being managed or a life being endured. It has the quality of something growing in the right direction, not without difficulty and not without loss, but with a fundamental rightness, a sense of things moving where they are meant to move. The ranch grew. Jonas added 20 head of cattle in the spring of Ellen's second year there, and another 25 the following spring. And by 1886, the herd was over 100, and the 40 acres had been expanded to 120 with the purchase of the adjacent parcel from a homesteader named Gus Wren, who had decided that farming was not for him and Colorado was cold and he was going to California, and God bless it. The expansion meant more fencing and more work and more careful management, and Ellen's ledgers grew from 1 book to 3, and the numbers in them grew from careful to genuinely good. The house was expanded too. In 1884, Jonas added 2 rooms, one for Daniel and one that would serve as a proper sitting room, and he did this work himself over the course of a summer with help from Harold Greer on the weekends. Harold's back having improved significantly in the 2 years since Ellen had fixed his accounts and removed the source of most of his stress. The new rooms were built with the same careful solidity as the original house, and the expansion made the place look less like a temporary arrangement and more like somewhere that had decided to last. In the summer of 1885, Ellen found herself expecting again. She told Jonas over breakfast again, with her hands folded in her lap again, and again he looked at her with that sequence of expressions that she loved, though this time there was less shock in it and more of something that was simply and completely joy. Their second child, a daughter, arrived the following February during a snowstorm that caused Jonas considerable anxiety because the roads were impassable for Mrs. Henderson, and the birth was attended instead by Eula Marsh and Mrs. Alcott, both of whom were competent and calm, and managed Jonas with the practiced ease of women dealing with a man whose helpfulness was theoretical, and whose presence was simply in the way. The baby was healthy and fierce and had dark eyes like her father and Ellen's tendency to make her opinions known immediately. They named her Clara, for no grander reason than that it suited her, which was, Jonas said, the best reason available. With Clara came a period of the ranch's life that Ellen remembered later as the fullest time, the time when the house was always warm and always a little chaotic, and always full of the sounds of children and work, and the particular music of a home that is genuinely inhabited. Daniel grew from a baby into a boy with his father's careful way of looking at things and his mother's facility with numbers, who could already do sums in his head at 4 that made Martha Greer predict loudly that he would be a businessman. Clara grew from a fierce newborn into a fierce toddler, and then a fierce child who had opinions about horses and strong feelings about fairness and a laugh that came from her stomach and filled whatever room she was in. Eula Marsh, who had been growing older in the incremental way of a person who simply adds to their age each year without seeming to diminish, became a kind of grandmother to the children in the way that the very old can be grandparents to other people's children, with a freedom that biological grandparents sometimes lack, entirely of love and none of the difficulty. Daniel called her Gran Eula, which was not something anyone had planned or suggested, but which simply appeared one day in his speech and stayed. Clara called her Eula, because Clara did not modify her address for anyone, and Eula appreciated this enormously. The trouble that came to Last Stop Ranch in the summer of 1887 was of the practical kind rather than the dramatic kind, and it came in the form of a dry summer followed by a dry fall, and then a hard early winter that arrived before the hay stores were fully built up and made the management of 120 head of cattle through to spring a genuine problem. It was the kind of problem that the West handed out regularly, and it was the kind of problem that either broke people or clarified them, depending on what they were made of. Jonas and Ellen sat with the ledger and the hay inventory, and the projected feed costs one November evening while the children were asleep, and the wind was making serious assertions at the walls of the house, and they went through the numbers together the way they always went through important things together, neither of them pretending to have answers they didn't have. "We could sell 30 head before winter," Jonas said. "Reduce the feed demand. Take the loss now rather than lose them in January." Ellen went through the numbers. "If we sell at current prices, which will not be good because it's known we're distressed, we take roughly a 35% loss on those animals. That hurts the spring considerably. But we keep the breeding stock and we come through." "We come through," she agreed. "And if we don't sell and we run short on feed by February, we could lose double." Ellen looked at the numbers for a long time, then she looked up. "Sell 30. Keep the best stock, sell the marginal animals first. Get Martin Doyle at the stockyard to negotiate the price so it's not obvious we're distressed. He owes you a favor." Jonas looked at her. "You remembered that." "I keep very thorough records," she said, "including favors owed." Martin Doyle, who ran the stockyard in the larger town of Benson's crossing 30 miles east, and who did indeed owe Jonas a considerable favor from an incident involving a flooded creek and 300 head of cattle that Jonas had helped round up 2 years prior, negotiated the sale at a price that was not embarrassing, and they came through the winter with their best cattle intact, and the ranch operational and their nerves somewhat frayed, but their partnership, if anything, more solid than before. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was a hard one throughout the territory, and it took a toll on smaller and less well-managed operations. 2 families in the area around Caldwell Creek lost their places that winter, and Jonas gave work to the men through the spring, and Ellen helped the families with provisions from the store and from the ranch's surplus, and neither of them discussed the acts of generosity because they were not done for discussion, but because the West demanded that people help each other when the alternative was watching a neighbor drown. By the spring of 1888, the cattle market had recovered, and the summer was wet enough and the hay stores rebuilt. And Last Stop Ranch came out of the difficult period with its herd intact and a reputation, in the quiet way such reputations build, as a place run by people who knew what they were doing and could be trusted through hard times. There was a morning in August of 1888 when Ellen stood at the gate of Last Stop Ranch with a cup of coffee, just after first light, and looked out at the land. The cattle were visible in the near pasture, moving slowly in the morning way of animals that have nothing to hurry toward. The mountains were going pink and gold in the rising light, and the creek was audible from the gate in the still morning air, and from inside the house she could hear the domestic sounds of a day beginning, Daniel's voice asking some question that his father was patiently answering, Clara's more emphatic voice adding a commentary that had not been requested. Ellen stood at the gate of Last Stop Ranch and felt, with a completeness that was beyond argument, that this was hers. Not hers as in ownership, which was a practical matter handled in a ledger, but hers in the deeper sense of the word, the sense of belonging. She belonged here. She had belonged here since April of 1882, when she stepped off a stagecoach in the wrong town with 11 cents and a crumpled letter, and found out that the wrong stop was the right one. She had come from nothing to this, from alone to this family, from penniless to this life that was not rich in the way of wealth but was rich in the way that mattered, full and warm and genuinely rooted in the earth it stood on. She stood at the gate until Jonas appeared beside her with his own coffee, moving with that particular ease, and stood there with her looking at the morning land. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I should have gotten off at the wrong stop years earlier," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood at the gate of Last Stop Ranch in the August morning of 1888, watching their cattle in their fields, and listening to their children inside, and drinking their coffee in the particular piece of people who have arrived. Later in the year, there was the question of Daniel's schooling, since the school in Caldwell Creek had expanded with the town, and now had a proper teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Patton who taught with both enthusiasm and discipline. And Daniel took to learning with the appetite of a child who has been absorbing information at every available opportunity, and is now being given formal permission to do so. He read everything, the way some children run everywhere, and Jonas built a second shelf for the books in what had become, through Ellen's persistent and practical reordering, a proper sitting room, and the shelf filled steadily. Clara, who began school 2 years behind her brother, and arrived on the first day with the expression of someone who intended to run the institution by the end of the week, proved to be excellent at mathematics and passionate about animals, and interested in almost everything the natural world had to offer. And Miss Patton wrote in her quarterly report that Clara Turner had opinions that were strongly held and vigorously expressed, and was an exceptional student in all subjects. And the manner in which she presented this information suggested she found it both exhausting and delightful. The news of the territory's politics reached Caldwell Creek in the usual imperfect way of small towns, through newspapers that were several days old, and the accounts of travelers and the conversations at Martha's store and the saloon, which Ellen had begun to view as an information distribution system rather than a moral problem. The territory was changing. Colorado had been a state since 1876, and the changes that came with statehood brought both benefits and new tensions, and the older hands in town held opinions about the new people coming in, and the changing cattle economy with varying degrees of acceptance and bitterness. Jonas and Ellen talked about these things in the evenings the way they talked about everything, with candor, and without performing a position for each other's benefit. He was cautious about change in the way of someone who had built something in specific conditions and worried about the conditions shifting. She was more open to it, perhaps because she had arrived as change herself and had not found it destructive. They disagreed sometimes, specifically and productively, in the manner of two people who respect each other's reasoning even while disputing the conclusion, and the disagreements always ended in the same place, which was that they were building something together, and they would navigate whatever came together as well. Eula Marsh died in the spring of 1889, which was a loss that moved through Ellen in the slow, deep way that the loss of a person moves when they have been genuinely foundational to who you are. Eula died in her sleep on a May morning, peacefully, in her own bed, which was entirely consistent with how she had lived, on her own terms and in her own space, and with no concessions to the preferences of others. The Reverend conducted the service, and Ellen spoke at it briefly, because Eula would have disapproved of lengthy sentimentality, and said only that Eula Marsh had been the person who made Caldwell Creek into a place Ellen could recognize as a home, and that the debt was one she carried gratefully rather than painfully, because Eula had given everything with the complete expectation that it would be put to use, and Ellen intended to keep putting it to use. Jonas buried Eula next to Daniel Marsh in the churchyard, which was what Eula had wanted, and Ellen planted larkspur around the grave because it seemed right, the same flower that had been in Jonas's first bunch of wildflowers, the flower of the creek bank and the meadow, and the first evening they had really begun. The grief was real and it was present for a long time, but it was not the hollow grief of loss without consolation, because Eula had known what was being built and had approved of it and had contributed to it directly, and nothing about her death undid any of that. The children asked about Gran Eula with the uncomplicated grief of children, openly and repeatedly, and Ellen answered them honestly, and the honesty seemed to help in the way that it usually did. By 1890, Last Stop Ranch had 160 head of cattle, 140 acres, a sound house with 4 rooms, a barn that was the best-built structure within 20 miles according to multiple independent opinions, and a reputation that had moved well beyond the county. Jonas had been asked twice to work with the Cattle Association in a formal capacity, and had declined both times, not out of disinterest, but because the association had policies regarding the smaller homesteaders that he found unjust, and he said so directly when asked, which was consistent with his character, and resulted in a respectful, if sometimes uneasy relationship with the larger ranchers in the area. Ellen was still working part-time at the general store, though it had evolved over the years from practical assistance to something more like partnership, since Harold's back had given out entirely in 1888, and Martha's eyes were gradually failing, and someone with full use of their hands and eyes, and an excellent facility with numbers was necessary for the store to function. Ellen had taken on a meaningful role in the enterprise, and Martha, in the way of a woman who has never given a compliment she did not mean, told Ellen in the summer of 1890 that she could not imagine running the store without her, and intended to leave her a share of it in her will. Ellen told her she hoped that would be a very distant eventuality. Martha said she agreed, and handed her a list of supplies to inventory. The summer of 1890 brought a particular kind of heat, the dry, enduring kind that settled over the high plains and did not lift for weeks, and during that summer Jonas and Ellen took the children on what Ellen called a proper adventure, and Jonas called a cattle-buying trip to the same area of Wyoming where Jonas had grown up. They traveled by train from Pueblo, which the children found extraordinary, and arrived in a part of Wyoming that was familiar to Jonas in the way places of early childhood are familiar, simultaneously smaller than remembered and more vivid. His brother Roy had moved to Pueblo from the mines by this point, and they saw Roy regularly, and Roy had married a round, cheerful woman named Louise who reminded everyone of Mrs. Henderson, and had 3 children who were of ages with Daniel and Clara, and got along with them with the immediate, unquestioning companionability of children. But Jonas had not been back to Wyoming since he left at 19, and being there with his wife and his children was the particular experience of seeing a past place from the ground of a present that is entirely different from what the past could have predicted. He showed Ellen the place where the Turner ranch had stood. There was nothing of it left, just a low outline in the grass where the buildings had been, a subtle depression that was only visible if you knew to look for it. Jonas stood in the grass and looked at the outline for a while, and Ellen stood beside him without saying anything, because she knew when words were needed and when they were not, and this was not. Daniel, who was 9 by this time and observant with the particular observance of a child who has learned that watching his parents tells him important things, stood beside his father on the other side and put his hand in Jonas's hand, and Jonas looked down at him, and then at Ellen, and what was on his face was not sadness, but something beyond sadness and beyond joy. Something that is only available to people who have come far enough from something hard to be able to hold it without being held by it. It was a beginning, Jonas said. Beginnings are supposed to be left behind, Ellen said. That's what they're for. He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and Daniel squeezed his father's hand from the other side, and Clara, who had been investigating something in the grass 10 feet away and had missed the emotional weight of the moment entirely, came over and said, "There's a prairie dog," with the urgency of someone reporting critical intelligence. The moment broke gently and completely, and they went to find the prairie dog. They came home to Caldwell Creek on a Tuesday evening in late August, arriving at the station in Pueblo and collecting horses and riding the last stretch to the ranch in the long summer evening. And when they came through the gate and Daniel read the sign aloud, "Last Stop Ranch," in the practiced way he did every time they came through it, something in Ellen settled all the way down, the last possible degree of settling, from being very happy here to being absolutely home. The century was turning. The territory was changing more rapidly now, the cattle economy shifting as barbed wire changed the nature of open range, and the railroads changed the nature of markets, and the steady arrival of homesteaders changed the nature of land itself, parceled and bounded and named in ways that the open West of 20 years earlier had not been. Some of this change was progress, the building of schools and hospitals and proper roads, the arrival of services that had required long journeys. Some of it was loss, the closing of spaces that had been defined by their openness, the formalization of a landscape that had been valuable partly because of its unruly wildness. Jonas watched these changes with the measured concern of someone who had bet everything on a particular vision of this land, and was watching the landscape of that bet shift around him. But he was not a man given to despair, and the ranch was strong, and his wife was beside him, and they had together the ability to adapt that comes from people who have had to adapt before, and discovered that they did not break. By 1892, Daniel was 11 and showing every sign of being, as Martha had predicted years ago, some kind of businessman, though his particular inclination was toward agriculture rather than trade, and he had read his father's cattle management manual from beginning to end and begun asking questions about breeding programs that Jonas answered as fully as he could, and then ordered a more advanced manual from a bookshop in Denver to supplement. Clara was 9 and had decided, with the finality of a person for whom decisions are permanent, that she wanted to be a veterinarian, a word she had encountered in a newspaper article, and which she had immediately and entirely adopted as her future without asking anyone's permission. Ellen told Jonas about this at dinner one evening, and Jonas was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was thinking carefully, and then he said, "Is there a school that teaches that?" Ellen said she would find out. She wrote to 3 different schools and found that the field of veterinary medicine was developing, that there were programs, that it was not impossible. She told Clara that it was not impossible, and Clara received this information with the look of someone who had known it all along. Jonas looked at his daughter over the dinner table with the expression he sometimes had when he was surprised by the future in the best way, and said, "All right, then." It was in the summer of 1893 that Ellen discovered she was expecting again. She was 34 years old by this time, which was not young for a pregnancy by the standards of the era, and she held the knowledge carefully for a week before telling Jonas, not from any reluctance but from the superstition of someone who has had enough good things that she is cautious about claiming the next one before it is certain. Jonas received the news in the way he always received such news, with that rearrangement of the interior, and said, "Are you all right?" And she said yes entirely, and he said, "3," in the wondering way of a man who has been consistently surprised by his own life and has not gotten over it. The third child arrived in February of 1894. Another boy, born in the house Jonas had built and expanded and continued to improve on the principle of adding to something rather than waiting for it to be finished. Attended by the doctor who had come to Caldwell Creek in 1891, and who delivered the baby with the professional efficiency of a person who had done this many times, and found it no less remarkable for that. They named him William, which had been Ellen's father's name, and the naming was a completion of something that had been waiting to be completed, a reaching back to the person whose death had started the long sequence of events that had led her here, a way of bringing him into the life that he had not been able to see. Jonas held William in the crook of his arm the evening after his birth and looked at him with the same expression he had worn when he held Daniel for the first time, and then he looked at Ellen in the bed, and the look he gave her was one she had been receiving for 11 years and which had not diminished by a single degree. "We have a lot of people," he said. "We do," she agreed, "and a ranch that can hold them. Ellen, Jonas." He leaned over and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that was entirely without performance, simply the physical expression of something that ran all the way down to the foundation of him. The years continue to pass in the way of years in a life that is working, not without difficulty, not without loss, not without the ordinary hard texture of the West in the 1890s, but with a fundamental rightness, a sense of the correct things being built and the correct people being built alongside them. Martha Greer died in 1895, having outlasted Harold by 2 years, and she left Ellen her share of the general store as promised, and Ellen found in the management of the store a continuation of something Martha had built, a responsibility she held seriously and with gratitude. She ran it well and employed 2 young women from town, teaching them the bookkeeping with the same thoroughness with which she had taught herself from a library manual in St. Louis, because she believed in the direct transmission of useful knowledge. Daniel, at 14, could ride and work cattle as well as his father and manage the accounts nearly as well as his mother, and had taken on a genuine role at Last Stop Ranch, not as a child helping, but as a young person with real responsibility, and Jonas treated him accordingly, with the respect of an employer and the love of a father, and the combination of the two that is the particular gift of a parent who manages to be both at once. Clara, at 12, had decided that, in addition to her veterinary ambitions, she was interested in the question of how the land itself worked, the soil and the water, and the interaction of these things with the cattle and the crops. And she read everything available on the subject and asked Jonas questions that he could answer only partially, and which led to correspondence with a professor at the Agricultural College in Fort Collins, whose responses Clara read with the concentration of someone receiving transmissions from the future. William grew from baby to toddler to small fierce person with a character that was, by general consensus, the most thoroughly his own of the 3 children, not obviously like either parent but with qualities drawn from both that had combined into something new. He was quiet where Clara was loud, patient where Daniel was quick, and he had a particular gift for sitting very still with animals, the kind of stillness that made the animals move toward him as if he had said something in a language they understood. The ranch in the late 1890s was one of the most successful operations in the county by any measure that mattered, not the largest and not the wealthiest but the most consistently sound, the place that came through hard winters and dry summers and market fluctuations with its core intact and its people whole. Jonas Turner had a reputation as a fair man and a straight dealer and a neighbor worth having, and Ellen Turner was known throughout the territory as someone whose word and whose numbers were both reliable, which was the kind of reputation that, in the West, was worth more than almost anything. The century turned with a party at the church that lasted until midnight and included a second fiddle and a third fiddle and someone's aunt who had brought a concertina from Denver and made everyone learn a polka whether they wished to or not. The children were allowed to stay up, and they did, and Daniel danced with a girl from town whose name was Annie Prescott, and whose presence in his vicinity had been making his usually composed face do unusual things for about 3 months. And Clara danced with everyone indiscriminately and with considerable energy, and William sat on Reverend Alcott's knee and went asleep at approximately 10 o'clock, as if the century was a matter of indifference to him. Jonas and Ellen danced, as they had danced at their own wedding reception 17 years earlier, and the dancing had in it everything that the intervening years contained: the work and the children and the hard winters and the good harvests and the deaths and the births and the ordinary 10,000 things that make up a life, all of it present in the particular way of two people who have been moving through the same life long enough that their bodies know each other in the deepest sense. 18 years, Ellen said. She was 41 years old and she looked exactly like herself, which was, she had long since decided, the best possible outcome of aging. Not quite, Jonas said. Not until August. You always correct me on the precise figure. You appreciate precision, he said. That's why I married you. Is that the reason? He looked at her with those dark eyes that had not changed, not in the deepest quality of them since the first day in the general store, the day she had been standing in the doorway with her trunk and he had looked at her with that focused attention, seeing something new in a familiar landscape. No, he said, that's not the reason. She leaned her head against his shoulder as they moved to the fiddle music and the concertina, and the sound of Caldwell Creek's 230-something souls celebrating the turn of the century in the leaning church. And she thought about 11 cents and a crumpled letter, and a stage driver calling a name she had heard wrong, and the way those small accidents of navigation had led to everything in the room around her and everything outside it. The dark ranch 3 miles west, the books on the shelves, the children asleep and not asleep, the larkspur on a grave in the churchyard, the name on the gate, the last stop that had been the right stop all along. Last Stop Ranch grew into the new century with the 3 Turner children growing alongside it, each one taking a piece of the life they had been born into and making it specifically their own. Daniel, who was 19 in 1900, married Annie Prescott in the same church where his parents had been married, and Reverend Alcott performed the ceremony with the satisfaction of a man who considers continuity one of the finer outcomes of pastoral life. Annie was a capable and good-humored young woman from a farming family east of Caldwell Creek, and she and Daniel settled into a life on the ranch's expanded eastern pasture, where Jonas and Ellen had built a small second house in 1899 on the understanding that someday one of the children would need it. Clara pursued her ambitions with the relentless efficiency that had always characterized everything she did, enrolling at the Agricultural College in Fort Collins in 1903, which required a particular kind of courage and a particular kind of argument to various institutional parties who had not entirely caught up with the idea of women in such programs. But Clara Turner was not the kind of person who allowed institutional parties to redirect her. And she arrived in Fort Collins with her father's methodical patience and her mother's absolute refusal to be managed. And she made her way through the program by being simply and unarguably better than the alternatives. William, quiet William with his gift for stillness, found his own path in the land itself, in the particular work of understanding soil and water and the long cycles of grass and cattle, and season that his sister had been curious about and that he had absorbed, without making a great demonstration of it, since he was old enough to walk in the fields. He became Jonas's closest working partner as Daniel took on more of the cattle operation, and the two of them, father and son, worked the land together with a compatibility that did not need many words. The morning that Ellen thought of later as the morning of full reckoning came in October of 1904, 22 years after she had stepped off the stagecoach in the wrong town with nothing to her name. She was 45 years old. Jonas was 51. They were sitting on the porch of Last Stop Ranch in the October morning, which was cool with the edge of the coming winter, and the mountains were clear and sharp in the distance, and the cattle were visible in the middle pasture, where William was riding them toward the south grazing land with the same unhurried ease with which his father had always moved. Daniel and Annie were visible on the far side of the property, working the fence line that bordered the Henderson farm, now run by the Henderson children, the old couple having passed within 2 years of each other in the late 1890s. Clara was in Fort Collins, her most recent letter reporting that she had been made an associate in a veterinary practice there, which she described in her characteristically direct way as a beginning rather than an achievement, and that she expected to have her own practice within 5 years, which those who knew her accepted as a statement of fact rather than aspiration. Ellen sat on the porch and held her coffee and looked out at the life she had built, and the land that held it and the people who were part of it, and beside her Jonas Turner sat with his own coffee and the posture of a man who is exactly where he belongs, and there was no sound for a while except the wind in the grass and the distant sound of William moving cattle and the deeper silence of the mountains beyond. "Do you remember," Jonas said, "when you told me you'd gotten off at the wrong stop?" "I remember." "I remember thinking," he said, "that whoever had the arrangement with you before was the biggest fool in Colorado." Ellen smiled at her coffee. "He was, rather." "I remember thinking," Jonas continued, "that Caldwell Creek had been my home for 7 years and I had never thought to be grateful for it until that morning, because if it had been anywhere else you might have gotten off somewhere else." "I might have gotten off in the right town," Ellen said, "and married a man I had never met and lived a life that had already been arranged for me." "Is that what you think would have happened?" She looked at him. "No," she said honestly. "I think I would have found my way out of it eventually. I don't think that life would have held, but it might have taken considerably longer to get here." "Here," he said. "Here," she agreed. The word was both enormous and exact. It contained the ranch and the family and the 22 years, and the 230 souls of Caldwell Creek, and the mountains to the west, and the creek that ran through the back of the property, and the grave in the churchyard with larkspur on it, and the books on the shelves and the children who were not children anymore and the life they were building still. Because a life does not finish any more than a ranch does. It simply keeps adding to itself. And that is not a shortcoming but the whole point. Jonas put his arm around Ellen, and she settled against him with the ease of someone who has been in the exact right place for a very long time and knows it, and does not take it for granted, and never has. In the spring of 1905, Annie gave birth to Daniel and Annie's first child, a boy they named Jonas Thomas Turner, which made Jonas Turner go still and then clear his throat and look at the mountains, which was what he did when something moved him past his usual capacity for expression. And Ellen held the baby and looked at the baby's face and felt the particular joy of a life that is continuing in the right direction, the joy of grandparenthood, which is love with the anxiety removed. Last Stop Ranch settled into the 20th century with the particular solidity of something that has earned its ground. The account books in Ellen's careful handwriting recorded not just the numbers but, in their way, the shape of a life, the years of struggle and the years of plenty, the losses taken and the recoveries made, the slow accumulation of something worth having. The general store in Caldwell Creek continued to be run with the thorough practicality that Martha Greer had established and Ellen had maintained, and the 2 young women Ellen had trained, Nora and Bess, were now managing between them with increasing competence and decreasing need for oversight. Caldwell Creek had grown. There were nearly 400 people in the town now, a proper school with 2 teachers, a doctor's office, a second general store that had opened in 1898 and whose proprietor was courteous to Ellen and slightly nervous around her, which she found reasonable since she had been there longer and had better prices. There was a new bank, there was a newspaper, there was a telegraph office. The town was a real town now, not the rough provisional settlement it had been in 1882. But the particular quality of Caldwell Creek that had made Ellen stay had not changed. It was still, at its core, a place made of people who had built their lives by hand from the available materials and who knew, with the knowledge that comes from that what mattered was not what you started with, but what you built from it. Ellen had built from 11 cents and a crumpled letter and an accident of navigation, and what she had built was large enough and warm enough and good enough that she would not have traded it for anything the arranged life in Harrow's Bend might have offered. Jonas Turner had built from a dead ranch and a Wyoming winter, and the particular stubbornness of a young man who believed that the right piece of land combined with enough work would produce a life worth having. And what he had built was everything he had bet on and more than he would have been able to predict on the day. Ellen stepped off the stage and stood in Martha Greer's store doorway with her trunk and her bright eyes and her calm refusal to be defeated by circumstances. They had built it together, which was the truest account of it, the account that the numbers in the ledger and the name on the gate and the children in the fields and the larkspur on the grave all testified to in their own ways, each one a record of the same fact, which was that the wrong stop had been, in every way that counted, the only stop, the right stop, the last stop, the one that held. On a clear October evening 23 years after Ellen Finley had stepped off a stagecoach in the wrong town with nothing, Jonas Turner walked to the gate of Last Stop Ranch as the light was going gold on the mountains, and stood at the gate post with his hand on the cedar plank where the letters were, and waited for his wife. She came out of the house with her coat on and her hair that was beginning to have silver at the temples, and she walked across the yard and came through the gate and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her and she looked up at the letters on the plank. Last Stop Ranch. 23 years since you carved that, she said. It held up, he said. You built it well, she said. Everything you build holds up. Jonas Turner looked at the mountains going pink and gold in the October evening and held his wife beside him on the ground they had made theirs, and he thought of Wyoming and Denver and the distance between then and now, and the distance was not distance at all but depth, the depth of a life that had been fully inhabited. Ellen, he said. Jonas, she said. No other words were needed and none were used. They stood at the gate of Last Stop Ranch in the evening light of a day that was ending exactly as it should, watched over by mountains and by the clear October sky, and by the particular piece of people who have stopped somewhere and known, from the very beginning and more certainly every year since, that this was exactly where they were supposed to be. The stars came out one by one above the Colorado plain, the same stars that had been there on the night they rode home from their wedding, unchanged and vast and indifferent to the small warm lives below them. And it was a good indifference, the kind that reminds you that what matters is not the permanence of a thing but the fullness of it, the living of it, the choosing of it every day in the way that love requires, the way that Jonas and Ellen Turner had chosen it, from a wrong stop in a right town. From the first day to the last,